Welcome everybody. If you are here to try and make a decision about what your levelling up priorities should be, then you're absolutely in the right place. My name's Andrew Laird. I'm the Managing Director of Mutual Ventures, and I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Mike Crowhurst, who is from Public First. Mike, do you want to just say a quick hello?
Hi there. Hi, everyone.
Mike will give a more full introduction to himself and Public First later. Just in terms of who Mutual Ventures are, we're a consultancy that is committed to improving life chances by making public services and public spaces better, more sustainable and more connected to communities. And we work with councils to develop local strategies. And at the minute, we're doing a lot supporting areas to develop levelling up plans, and in particular bids to the Levelling Up Fund. And in round one, which was last year, we supported 5 bids and 4 of those were successful. And we're going to be talking a little bit about levelling up round 2 later. Levelling up has been quite a nebulous concept. Up until quite recently, it's been all things to all people, but at least now we have a levelling up white paper. And I think it's fair to say that the document is very strong on analysis, very strong on history, and also strong on ambition and how those ambitions will be measured. But there are some gaps which need filling, which connect the really good analysis on what the problems are with ambition. And I think that we would certainly expect to see more coming from government to fill those gaps. It's very strong on the why change needs to happen and the what needs to happen. It's the how bit in the middle which needs some fleshing out. And it feels very much like a mid-term manifesto from the government. And it's very welcome, but it just, in my view, I don't think it can quite bring itself to say that the government should only invest in areas which need levelling up. It's very clear that it wants to see improvement across the country, but the key ambition is to see the gap between high performing areas and lower performing areas closing. But the bit of the levelling up agenda which is very localized and will result in differentiation is the Levelling Up Fund. So within that fund, you have a choice as a local area what to put in your Levelling Up Fund bid. And we'll talk more about the exact process of that later. But the first thing that we always do with councils when we're supporting them is to try and help them make a decision on priorities. And I'll go through an example of how we do that. But in order to be able to do that, you really need to understand what the priorities of local people are. And that's where Mike and Mike's organization come in. So before I hand over to Mike, just some housekeeping. You will be able to post questions on the Q&A function. You won't be able to speak live, unfortunately, but you can put your questions up there and we'll do our best to try and get to them. And then also any slides that we share today, we will distribute to attendees. So there's no need to take screenshots or anything like that. So that's all from me. And Mike, I'd love to hand over to you now.
Thanks very much, Andrew, and good morning, everyone. It's really, really great to be with you. I'm just going to share my screen, if that's okay, because I've got a couple of slides to take you through. So let me get this ready. Okay. And hopefully that should be coming up for you. Great, thanks, Andrew. I'm going to speak for about 20 minutes this morning and just give you some insights into the work that Public First has done on public attitudes to levelling up. We've done some polling and a lot of other research that has given us various different insights, which we thought it would be useful to share. Just quickly, a bit of background on me and Public First. So Public First is a small policy research, opinion and strategy consultancy. We've got offices in London and Manchester, and we've worked for a range of different clients. You can see some of them on the right-hand side there. So everything from big private firms like Google through to public sector clients like Ofsted, and some government departments and local government as well, which I'll come on to in a second, but also some smaller clients as well. So charities, startups, various different foundations. And really our sort of specialism is in combining public opinion research with policy expertise. So we do a lot of projects for various different clients that bring together insights into where the public are on an issue that matters to them, and then helping them think through their strategy or their lobbying in terms of policy change that they want to see, but also decisions they might want to make as an organization. And our staff reflect those different interests. So we've got people with expertise in research, but also people with deep background in government. So I'm a former special advisor in government to one prime minister and two cabinet ministers. We've got a couple of other political advisors in the team as well, and then lots of civil servants and people with backgrounds in the various different sectors that we specialize in. So particularly tech, education, and levelling up. So people with backgrounds in different parts of the country. And if I just kind of zoom in on the work that we've done on levelling up specifically, so we've worked for a range of different local and central government clients, as well as some private sector clients. And just to give you a flavour of some of those different projects, so we worked for Exeter and Greater Manchester on their strategy development. So Manchester, in the wake of the pandemic, using public opinion research to work out what their priorities should be in terms of setting their strategy post-COVID, and Exeter doing some work for them to try and position themselves in Westminster. We've done work for the LGA on issues like fiscal devolution. We actually worked for the Cabinet Office way back when, developing the kind of original concept of levelling up. So using focus groups to test what sort of things the public wanted to see from it. And more recently, we've also worked for private sector organisations like Primark and Landsec on issues like the future of high streets after COVID and the future of city centres. And what we're going to go through this morning are the findings from a poll that we did at the end of last year. This is one of the largest polls that has been done so far on public attitudes to levelling up. It was a poll of just over 2,000 people. We asked just over 100 questions, and it was really trying to get into what the public want to see from the policy. This, of course, was in advance of the white paper being published, and then that was used to try and inform the approach that government was taking, but also various different clients as well. And the findings of this were actually presented to Michael Gove and his team back in January in advance of the white paper. So it was definitely something that was shaping their thinking. So I will try not to give you too many slides this morning, but there are 10 that I've pulled out from the poll. It's worth saying that I'll send around the link to the actual data so that you can go through it yourselves, because, like I said, there are a huge number of questions and you can cut them in a vast number of ways. So, you know, you can look at these issues regionally, by social grouping, by gender, by age, but I'll kind of mostly focus on geography and then also the type of area for us this morning. So just a quick kind of bit of context on where the public are with the idea of levelling up. If you ask most people about whether or not they think that they have heard of the concept or understand it, it may not surprise you that awareness is fairly low. So when we asked that question in our poll, only around 20% of people said that they feel very familiar with levelling up. And that would definitely reflect the experience that we would have in the focus groups that we run, where by and large, this is not really something which people very feel familiar with. When you then ask about whether or not people think their own area needs levelling up, or where they think most needs levelling up, you get some quite interesting responses. So people are most likely to say that the Northeast is the area which needs levelling up, and that's reflected in this poll here. You can see that the Northeast comes just about top in terms of people within that region feeling like their area is going to benefit from this policy. But you also then have some other quite counterintuitive findings too. So, you know, we know that a lot of the slogans around levelling up have been about moving resources out of London and the Southeast, but actually people in London and the Southeast are just as likely, if not more in the case of London, to say that they think they need levelling up compared to places like the East of England. So the public's kind of relationship with this, I think, is still pretty nascent. Now, in terms of trying to work out how people think about levelling up and what their priorities are, our poll tried to get into this in a couple of different ways. One of the concepts that we focused quite a lot on was local pride and what sort of things drive this and how people feel about their area. If you ask people whether or not they feel proud of their area, then the vast majority of people do. So well over 60% of people in almost every place will say that they feel proud of where they're will say that they're proud of where they come from. But there are some quite big differences if you then get into whether or not people feel that pride is consistent with the pride that people have felt over time. So we went back kind of up to 50 years, but if we just look at 10 years ago, we can see that there is this sense of decline in lots of areas. So interestingly, over on the left, you can see that in urban and city centres, people actually feel that pride is stronger now than it was 10 years ago. And that might reflect some of the balance of investment that's gone into those places. But actually, almost everywhere else, they're more likely to say that pride is weaker. And particularly in large towns and small towns, there is a sense that pride is weaker. In terms of why that is, we asked about why people felt that civic pride has declined. And really what I think this slide shows is that it's often some of the softer social factors that sort of add up to the feel of a place that inform that feeling. So, people feeling that there are fewer local jobs or that local industry has declined matters, but it doesn't matter as much as a sense that antisocial behaviour has risen, or that the high street is more run down, the whole place feels poorer, or even actually that there are some things just like litter and that there is more litter and rubbish around. And those findings are relatively consistent across those different types of settlements. Now, trying to get underneath that, we were also asking some questions about what people think most fosters local pride. And we might want to come back to this later when we talk about some of the policy responses that people want to see from levelling up. But again, it's quite interesting to see here that although local employers matter and industrial heritage matters, again, issues like parks and green spaces, historic buildings, high streets, they come out top. And in particular, the people who live in a place are just about the most important driver of local pride. So that sort of social fabric of a place is obviously very, very important in terms of how people feel about it. Another way of getting into this issue about why people might feel that they've seen this decline is just a straightforward question about whether or not they feel the area is better or worse than 10 years ago. Again, we see a similar pattern here where people in urban and city centres are more likely to say that their area is doing better than it was 10 years ago. But in large and small towns and suburbs and villages, they're more likely to say that it's doing worse. And in terms of why that is, we see some similar sorts of findings. So crime and antisocial behaviour is higher. Interestingly, you'll see over there on the left that actually the biggest concerns around that are in urban and city centres and their suburbs. So although people feel generally more satisfied about where they live and that pride is stronger, a big concern for those places is crime and antisocial behaviour. And that's something that was reflected in a recent report that we did on the future of cities. It's less of an issue in towns, whereas towns have got more of an issue around the quality of their high streets. And then also we see some other factors coming through here. So public transport, and then also to a certain extent, but particularly in rural areas and villages, the kind of impact of closure of local services like libraries matter, as well as actually things like events and markets and festivals. So we were also asking people around what sort of policies they think that the government should focus on. Now, as you'll see here, the strongest responses tend to come around ideas like retraining people in areas where industry has declined, but also encouraging business investment into particular parts of the country was something that was very popular too, particularly in urban and city centres. And again, reflecting what was driving people's sense of decline, a focus on boosting high streets was important too, as well as improving public transport. And that's particularly the case the further you get out of urban and city centres. So interestingly, some of those softer issues which people feel drives decline, so that might be that drives local pride. So there might be parks and green spaces, some of the cultural assets they've got like local museums. When you put them up against issues like retraining and education or business investment, they don't come out as strongly. But I do think it is something to keep a focus on, given that is something which people obviously kind of feel matters in terms of how they feel about their area. And then I've just got some slides here which focus on specifics and some of the things that you might be able to kind of bid for money for through the Levelling Up Fund itself. There are three. So we've got transport, the high street, and then we've also got some sort of culture options too. So in terms of transport, I know that there's been a lot of focus on public transport and particularly fast rail with Levelling Up investment. But actually our poll here, you can see, would show that for most people, spending on roads is as important, if not more important. And that's increasingly so the further you get out of big cities. So, you know, spending on roads in small towns and large towns and villages comes out very strongly, as does spending on local parking. That's relatively strong as well. Whereas investing in fast rail links is much less of a priority, and investment in public transport generally is a bit of a less of a priority. In terms of what people do want to see spending on, they're much more likely to say that they see buses as important rather than their local railways. And then policies around the high streets. So by far the most popular policy in almost everywhere, apart, interestingly, from urban and city centres, is lowering business rates. Obviously not something that you can do through the Levelling Up Fund, but something that might be of interest to people on the call. Beyond that, public transport then matters, but also policies to try and improve the way that high streets are used. So making better use of vacant shops, either as housing or offices, or also some ideas that people might be considering around reusing vacant lots for public services, so GP surgeries, education establishments, etc., etc. Again, reflecting the responses on transport, people felt that it was important to have to make it easier to drive and park, so that they can actually use high streets and town centres, and invest in attracting people to come into them. We did ask a question. We did have as an option here cultural attractions. That didn't score quite so well, but certainly things like renovating historical buildings and monuments, and kind of introducing more greenery into town centres does relatively well. I think again there you can just see this point about trying to improve the look and feel of a place, which I think, you know, in our experience would kind of run as a kind of dual track of levelling up. So it basically reflects that the sort of big infrastructure investments in transport and productivity really matter, but also that people want to see the ways in which they interact with the place and the kind of quality of the feel of a place kind of focused on too. And lastly, we asked some questions here around what I kind of broadly term as local culture, but kind of is slightly broader than that. So the most attractive options here in terms of what people would like to see more spending on were clubs and spaces where people can get together. So things like youth clubs or clubs for senior citizens. And that's pretty consistently popular, but especially in some of our towns and suburbs. But you then also have an interest in other sorts of shared spaces, and sports clubs, the sort of social fabric of a place, but also investment in local museums and arts and culture too. So that's a kind of very brief run through, Andrew. I'll stop there, but I know that we've got some questions and some time for discussion, so we can come back and get into the specifics if that's useful.
Fantastic, Mike. Thank you very much. That's really interesting. If you can unshare your screen, I shall share a few slides of my own. So what I'm intending to do, and we've already got some questions coming in for Mike on that, and we will definitely get to those later. Well, what I want to do is talk a little bit about what we know about the Levelling Up Fund so far, and also the structure of the bids, and then also consider what to do with this information. So you've got an idea now of what local priorities might be. You'll be looking at your own, and what do you actually do with that? How do you decide which projects to engage with?
Sorry, Andrew, I'm just
that's okay. I think I can override you.
I think I've stopped. Have I stopped
yeah.
now? Yeah.
Yes. Excellent. Great. Mike, can you just give me a thumbs up if that looks like it's come through okay? Excellent. So what do we know about the fund so far? So as we all know now with the white paper and all of the rhetoric, that this will indeed be a key driving force for the UK government's domestic agenda. It's a complex fund, it's wide ranging, and that means that it's jointly managed by 3 different departments. The Treasury, which obviously holds the purse strings, the Department for Transport, and the newly named Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities. The total value of the fund, that's including the first round, which has already gone, will be 4.8 billion, and that's across all 4 of the UK nations. 600 million of that needed to be spent this year. All of that money will have been accounted for in round 1, which was in June last year. It's designed to support regions, cities, towns, communities with physical infrastructure, but also social infrastructure. And that's a really important point, because in round 1, most of the bids were for the physical infrastructure. And I think that what we will probably see in round 2 is an expectation that there is a broadening of that, and that real social infrastructure projects are included as well. And as I said earlier, the first round of bidding was completed last year. The bids were in June, and awards were made in the autumn. And the only thing we know so far about the timing of round 2 is that it will be in the spring. So in government terms, as Mike will know, spring is a long period. So I think it's a case of watching it very closely and seeing when that comes out. In terms of what you're allowed to do as a council or local authority, the number of bids that you can submit is based on the number of MPs you have on your patch. So if you're a larger council with, say, 4 MPs, all within your council area, you can make 4 bids. If you're a smaller district, for instance, with just 1 MP, then you can make 1. And any bid supported by an MP can be up to the value of 20 million. There are also opportunities to bid for larger transport schemes, and that has to have the support of the relevant transport authority. Category 1, so yeah, it's important. It's worth noting that when the government launched the Levelling Up Fund, they categorized councils into category 1, 2, and 3, 1 being the most in need of levelling up funding, and 3 being the least in need. All category 1 councils will get, and have got already, £125,000 worth of capacity support. That's regardless of how many MPs you have or how many bids you will be required or that you want to make. Each category 1 area will get that funding, and that's to support you to do the work on the bid and to give you the best chance of putting in a really compelling bid. But there's nothing to stop councils that haven't got that funding from also doing that. Your bid can be a package, or it can be for a single thing. So it could have a number of elements to it. So let's just say, for example, it was an urban regeneration bid. It might have some work on a bus station, it might have something to do with the local library, and it might have some shop frontage. All of those are fine to have in one bid, as long as there is a connecting golden thread. So there has to be one vision that all of the different elements work towards. You can't just put in 3, 4 random projects and expect that to be successful. And then the thing which is really key, and this links to the fact that each MP can support 1 bid, and that the number of bids you could put in is based on the number of MPs, is that each MP can support 1 bid. And your MP doesn't have to support it, but it's the very first question that the application form asks. And I think a bid that does not have the support of the MP would find this process difficult. So in terms of what it itself looks like, and I'm basing this entirely on round 1, and I wouldn't expect the structure to change much. The actual priority themes may change a little bit, but the bid structure will stay largely the same, I would imagine. It's in 3 bits, and this is very much based on the Treasury 5 case business case model, which some of you may be familiar with. So the first element is strategic fit. The key bits here are, what's your case for change? Why do you need this investment? Why is there a market failure that needs addressing through public funding? You've got to be able to show support from local people, from your local MP, from councillors, etc. And you've got to also show that what you're proposing aligns with both your local plans that are already in place, any national plans, and any central government plans. So an example there would be, if you have an environmental impact, you have to show that that actually contributes to what all of the different levels of government are trying to achieve. The second element of the bid is the value for money section, and this is all about showing that the government investment will be repaid and then some. So the ultimate goal here is to have a really good benefit cost ratio. So if you're asking for investment from government of 10 million, you've got to be able to show that the return on that, both in terms of economic gains and social gains, public health gains, will be more than that. And obviously, the better ratio, the better. Then the final section is on deliverability. So you may have fantastic plans, you may be able to demonstrate that this is really good value for money, but then you also have to be able to show that you can actually deliver it. There are three main sections of this. The first one is finance, where you show how much it will all cost, what the different pay, if there's match funding coming from other places. Then the commercial section is all about the practical those, and then the final section is around management. So do you have a team in place who can make this happen? Do they have experience? And then also, do you have a project plan that appreciates dependencies and appreciates the timing of everything? So that's the general structure of the bid. But what I'd really like to talk about now is just what to do with all of this information Mike has given us. And I'm sure that you will also have your own information locally, and you'll want to know, how do you actually prioritize things? How do you decide what to actually put in your bid? So within the bid, a key part of it is, and it specifically asks for this, is something called a theory of change. So what is a theory of change? A theory of change is a tool or a process which allows you to identify what problem you're trying to solve, figure out where you want to get to in the future, and then to populate the middle bit with all of the different things which you will do, which will solve the problems and get you to where you want to be in the future. So it very much follows why, what, and how. So the why bit is, what problem are you trying to solve? What are the market failures? The what is, what are we going to do about that? What change are we going to try and put in place? What are the programs? What are the propositions that we want to adopt? And then the how is then, pardon me, the what is what good looks like at the end of the process, and then the how is what I just said. Sorry, I muddled that up. Just to try and explain this a bit more, this is a theory of change template. So this shows how it flows across. So the first thing you would think about is the context. So what's the challenge and failure? What's the impact of that challenge and failure? Then at the far end, you've got the outcome that you're trying to achieve. And then within that, in the middle, you've got the various propositions and their direct outputs. And if we try and map that to what I've just talked through, that's very much the why, the what, and the how. And it's really important that you do the why first, the what second, before starting to consider what your actual intervention should be, because until you know what your problems are and where you're trying to get to, it's impossible, or it's unwise to think about exactly what you should be doing. So if I give you an example of one of our round one bids. As far as the context goes, a challenge that was identified was that this particular town had a lack of evening and leisure economy. And the impact of that was there was a lack of confidence for business investment, very few entry-level jobs for local people, very low aspiration for people to stay in town. Young people wanted to move out. As far as evening entertainment, the people traveled elsewhere. And there was a very strong perception of crime in the evening because it was very quiet and it wasn't very welcoming. Then when we think about the outcomes then, which we did next, town centre, they want the town centre to feel busier, to feel more prosperous and more attractive. They want there to be an improved perception of the space in terms of somewhere that you would really want to spend time and for that to feel safe. Mike's point about increased pride was very important. People did not feel proud of their town, but they really wanted to. And they also wanted their young people to have more employment and skills opportunities. There was a very strong feeling that people were moving away from the town. And then that feeling of it being unsafe and that perception of crime within the town, they were very keen for that to be reduced. So with those two important bookends of the context and outcomes, we then were able to work with them to think about what their proposition should be. And this is one example. So the plan, which this town eventually went for, was the redevelopment of an unused large site to a cinema. And the idea there was that this would give the town a really good, cornerstone place that everything else could build round. And then, as an addition to that, there was some investment in the facades and infrastructure of the surrounding shop units and restaurant units. And the outputs from that would be a wider range of leisure activities, increasing the number of visitors into the town, increased spend, and increased local employment and skills opportunities. So hopefully you can see there. Now, this is not a complete theory of change, but it is a partial example of one. Hopefully you can see how the context and the outcome that it is desired is very much linked by what their levelling up bid was proposing. So with that, I will stop sharing and we'll take some questions. So Mike, I want to just jump straight in with one question of my own. So the type of work that you're talking about would take some time. It can't just be done overnight. So, and I certainly know from my experience from round one that once the starting gun is fired on the fund, that time is very short. So when is the best time to start doing that, the type of research that you would do?
Thanks, Andrew. I mean, we can turn around some of this research fairly quickly. So you can put together some focus groups and you can put together some polling in a couple of weeks. But I would say that ideally you would be looking to try and engage on this sort of exercise a couple of months in advance of the bid that you want to make, partly because that will give you more time to kind of gather a bigger bank of evidence. And certainly polling at a local level does take a little bit of time to set up, and you might want to, and you probably want to use several focus groups to try and get some really rich insights. But also then, because I think the best work that comes out of this sort of evidence kind of gathering is when it's then applied to sort of policy application. And so you want to kind of be able to kind of work through gathering the evidence in, but then actually thinking about what it tells you rather than just having the raw data there.
Yeah, so never too early to start.
Indeed,
and,
yeah.
and I think from our own experience of working with councils, this type of local research is incredibly important for the development of general council strategies, and it's not just about applications to the Levelling Up Fund. And I would link this back to the point I made just now about it being very important that your Levelling Up Fund bid links in and supports your overarching local area strategies as well. So your priorities for the Levelling Up Fund should really be the same that you have for the council as a whole. It was also really interesting to see the importance of local parks and green spaces, and particularly when people are asked about what fosters local pride, and that's not just in small villages and towns, but everywhere. And certainly we've seen quite a big focus on parks, particularly through the government's Towns Fund. Can you say a little bit more about that? Because it might seem odd that would be something that people would really prioritize.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting finding. I mean, I think there are probably two things to say there. So I think in terms of why that comes out so strongly, I think it's probably of a piece with some of the other findings that we have. If you think about the other things that were particularly likely to be seen as fostering local pride, so the local historic buildings, the kind of heritage of an area, high streets, I think a lot of this is about the way in which people interact with these things. And certainly if I think back to some focus group work that we've done, a lot of it will be about the sorts of spaces in which people kind of build their experiences with their families over generations, and parks and green spaces are probably a really good example of that. So, I can think of some focus group work that we were doing in Derby just before Christmas, where people talked about a local green space as something that they really thought that the area should be making more of, in contrast to what they thought was being done really well in Nottingham. And I think what kind of did it for them and why that mattered to them was because this is somewhere they wanted to be able to, they had both been as children and was kind of lodged in their memory, but they also then wanted to kind of take their kids and was kind of, a real resource for the community. In terms of why it matters for government, if I kind of put my old advisor hat on, I think this is a good example. Parks and green spaces are probably a good example of the sort of quick win that government can get from levelling up. So we know that it kind of turning things around on skills and infrastructure takes quite a significant amount of time, but actually kind of making a high street or a green space or a park feel kind of better and more attractive is something that you can do relatively quickly. So that's definitely going to be something that's in the mind of ministers too.
Excellent. Thank you, Mike. Just as a reminder to everybody, you can put your questions in the Q&A. I can see that we've got some coming in now, which I'll now get to. So Mike, when considering what levelling up policies the government should focus on, certainly it's good to see the encouragement of private business investment featuring highly, because I think in some people's minds, and potentially in some council minds, and potentially in some of the minds of the public, it could be seen as just government investment as a start and finish of the whole thing. But actually, the really important thing here, and what is important when making funding applications as well, is that the public funding is seen as a catalyst to unlock other funding and not an end in itself. I wonder if you've got any thoughts on that, given what the survey had said.
No, I agree, and I think it's reflected in the way that if you look through the levelling up white paper, which in some ways is kind of relatively weaker, I think, on the role of the private sector compared to the public sector. There's probably a lot more written about what government does than what the private sector will do. But this idea of public-private sector partnership is something that comes through really, really strongly in the white paper. And so I think that's something that ministers will definitely be kind of thinking about a lot in terms of what they want to see. In terms of the polling and public attitudes, I mean, we might want to come on to this and talk about devolution more generally, but I think one thing to bear in mind is that in terms of the actors that people kind of see as responsible for local change, it's often not just government. And because we work in and around government, we kind of are probably tend to kind of default to thinking that those are the people that kind of make change. But actually, in terms of public attitudes, they do think that there's a really important role for government. And actually, compared to some bits of the Conservative Party, for example, most people would want to see a much more activist state. But actually, they also think that local employers and local private investment is incredibly important. And again, going back to some of the focus group work that we were doing in Derby, the things that they were most proud of were some of the big cornerstone employers and the way that they felt they played a role in the local area. So there's definitely something there in terms of trying to kind of work with those kind of private sector players as well as government itself acting.
Great. I'm going to bring in just one of another for questions here from Linda Slack is asking an example of a good social infrastructure project. And I want to link this to some of your research and how it was interesting to see social clubs like youth clubs and clubs for older people featuring strongly alongside the likes of libraries and sports clubs when thinking about improving local culture. And I know certainly in my head, when I think of social infrastructure, I'm thinking about that community social capital, the clubs, the libraries, the sports clubs, the youth clubs, that type of thing, which can really build an area that's not just about the economy. Would that be fair?
No, I definitely agree. And you know, there's quite a lot of interest, I think, at the moment in government in the concept of social infrastructure. And if you look at some of the ministers and kind of people who've been appointed into the Levelling Up department, people like Danny Kruger, this is something that they've written about quite extensively. So it's definitely going to be something that they will be thinking about. And yeah, I mean, the polling, I think, found, you know, really strong support for that idea of community space and civic assets as something that people should kind of focus investment on. And definitely, if I think about my old role at the culture department, you know, we were very, very interested in the role that kind of culture and heritage assets can play in civic regeneration. And in terms of where we were spending other government funds, not just the Levelling Up funds, that was something that we had quite a big focus on. So similar to your project, Andrew, with the cinema, you know, it's the role that a theatre or, you know, a historic building can play, not just in kind of being a business and a service for local people, but also again in providing a meeting space, in providing something that kind of makes a town centre a more attractive place to go to, because it has a cafe and sort of space for people to get together, offers kind of, you know, skills training, all those sorts of different things.
Great. So another question I've got here is, at what stage of the business case development would transport schemes need to be considered, and what would the timescales for delivery need to be? So I'll take that one. I think, well, the transport schemes tend to be the most complex, and certainly when you look at the guidance, the requirements for the level of detail within the application is based on the Department of Transport's guidance on preparing business cases, which is much more detailed. So the answer to that is the sooner the better, particularly if you're intending to include a transport scheme. And what timescales would need to be, my understanding, at least in round one, the last I heard, was that the money from the government's perspective would need to be spent by the end of 24-25. So that would be the end of March 2025. But my understanding is that any match funding could extend beyond that. So if you have a large transport scheme that might run beyond that, that's fine. But as long as the government's contribution through the fund is spent by that point, that's fine. Mike, I want to just turn to something which featured pretty heavily in the white paper, which was devolution. And my question is, I guess, to put it bluntly, do the public care where decisions are made?
No, it's a really good question, and actually, you know, we asked some questions about this in the poll, and it kind of shows pretty clearly that the public don't see devolution as a big priority. So there's a slightly different version of the question that I showed you the findings for, around where people think the government's priorities should be on levelling up. Devolution and kind of more power to local government was one of the options in that, and it was kind of way down the list in terms of what people wanted government to focus on. So you know, I think it only scored 11%, well below kind of tackling antisocial behaviour, investing in public transport, those sorts of things. I think that probably reflects two things. One, you know, I don't think the public are particularly, I'm not sure that people have strong views about kind of where the levers of power lie. They just want to kind of have better services. And so there's probably something in just kind of wanting to focus on outcomes rather than how things are done. I think the other thing, which is a challenge, and I say this with the greatest amount of respect for colleagues on the call who are kind of from local government, is that, you know, I think we've got to remember that in some areas, you know, local government is something which, you know, people can have different relationships with, and kind of saying to them that their council is going to get more power to do something is not something that they will automatically see as better than Westminster. Although I think there is definitely a sense that the closer decisions are made to people, the kind of more likely that they are to take into account kind of local considerations. I mean, interestingly, when we asked some questions around devolution, we were as likely to see support for things like kind of budgets kind of being kind of, or local groups, community groups, charities, etc., being given more control over budgets as we were mayors and other actors. So in terms of bids, I don't know to what extent they kind of encompass work with other stakeholders, but actually, that is something that, based on our polling, people would probably be quite supportive of. So kind of delivery alongside civil society and other people locally.
Yeah, so that almost devolution right down to community level rather than kind of another, yeah. I read some of your research specifically on Greater Manchester, and what I took from that was that some of the areas, if we take Greater Manchester as an example, who have already experienced a greater level of devolution, quite liked it once they'd experienced it, whereas other areas that maybe hadn't had it weren't that bothered about it. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that is fair. I mean, I think there was a particular Manchester effect, actually. Now, I suppose Manchester, to some extent, has had devolution for longer and it's had it more deeply than other places. That didn't hold out quite so much for places like the West Midlands, which have had quite high-profile devolution in recent years, but maybe it hasn't been quite as deep and or been around as long as other areas. But yes, I think in broad terms, once people have got a sense of have had a bit of a taste of kind of things being done locally, particularly if obviously if they're done successfully, then they're more likely to want it. And I do think that, if we step back from public opinion, just in terms of the policy direction of things, my big takeaway from the white paper was that sort of devolution ratchet was probably the kind of biggest, the most long-term legacy of the white paper. I can't see Whitehall kind of turning back on that. And I think that is very much the long-term direction in terms of more power being handed down.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks, Mike. So I've got a question here from Christine Bayliss. We've heard that in the next wave, culture may not be a theme. Culture was one of the three main themes in round one, and asking us if we have any thoughts on the themes. And this is against a backdrop, I guess. If you're a council who had put in a culture bid first time and potentially wasn't successful, could you put that in again? I have to admit, I haven't heard that much about what the themes might be, and certainly I haven't heard that culture may not be a theme, because that is because I think what I have heard is that there should be a greater emphasis on social capital, which lends itself towards culture. So I'm hoping that's not right, but I don't know, Mike, if you've heard anything.
I mean, just based, I guess, on my kind of relatively recent experience in government. So I only left kind of 3 months ago or so. I would have thought that culture is likely to be a theme for two reasons, really. One, the government's just been making some huge investments in culture to support the sector through COVID, and I think there will be a real desire to make sure that isn't lost. New money for culture is going to be quite hard to find, but this is one way of kind of making sure that the sort of investment that has been made is supported. And two, kind of reading the runes in terms of what we've seen from DCMS about the balance of culture spending, there is definitely an appetite to move some of the balance of investment kind of out of London and the South East and towards areas that haven't had it. But we're not talking there about huge sums of money. And so I think actually, in terms of if the government wants to see more cultural activity outside in towns and smaller cities, which it definitely does, then this is a big way of doing it. So I would have thought that culture would still feature prominently. Actually, it did feature very prominently. I think something like more than 60% of all the successful bids had a cultural element to them.
Yeah.
So I think it will be there. Although I would also agree with you, Andrew, that I think social infrastructure is something that is probably quite likely to be focused on too.
Yeah, no, Christine, many thanks for that question. We're hoping that culture will remain a key theme. I've got a question. There's no name to this one, but what stage do plans need to be at for in terms of the solution when the bid is submitted? For example, what stage of design pricing is required if funding is for a new building? So you need to have an idea of cost. I mean, there is no fixed stage that it has to be at, but if you're at an early stage, you need to be able to demonstrate very clearly what your process will be and the timing of that process to give the assessors confidence that you will actually get through. You're talking about a building here, to get through the planning process and construction and everything like that. So there's no set place where it needs to be at, but you need to be able to demonstrate within, particularly the deliverability, the section which I described earlier, that you have a plan in place, you know exactly what you're going to do, and that you know that the timing will work in terms of when money must be spent. Mike, just another question I had. So on high street policies, I'm very interested in the concept of family hubs, which is an idea where you have a local presence of public services that are there particularly to support vulnerable families. The thing about family hubs is that it combines all sorts of things like, you know, social care, youth justice, youth centres, police, all in one place. And it was interesting that in your survey, there was a desire from the public to see public services located in vacant lots on the high street. Is there anything more that you want to say about that?
So I think it probably kind of comes back to that sense of what people want to see from their high streets, which is, you know, sort of more thriving, better used places, and, you know, bringing families into the high streets in the way that could do is something that people will probably see as attractive. And I know that, again, if you kind of ask people about whether or not they'd like to see schools located close to high streets and town centres, you get quite strong support for that too. In terms of kind of where the government are in it, I mean, I think the appeal for Whitehall in this is that it is notoriously difficult to get departments to work together kind of across borders, as it were, kind of in that big macro way. And actually, often these initiatives are better done sort of from the ground up. So I think there's, you know, probably likely to be quite, you know, I think people would probably quite welcome those sorts of local initiatives, because it's difficult to get departments working in that way together, not least because you can't see the kind of local need in a way that councils can. So it's definitely something which is very interesting, I think.
Yeah, thank you. So I just want to quickly catch a couple more questions here. So really good question from Julian Rudd. One of the key reasons for a decline in the quality of public spaces, parks, green spaces are cuts to local government funding. How do we get around the long-term maintenance aspects when we propose improvements? I think Julian, that's a question that we could spend all day talking about. Demonstrate sustainability. So however you are going to address this, what's not going to be acceptable is a funding up front from government to put something in place and then no long-term plan to keep it sustainable. Now, some of the bids that we worked on in round one solved this problem through partnerships with the private sector and other funders, where they actually there was in a sense an agreement that the public purse would fund the upfront investment and others would work with the public sector to actually maintain it. So you could apply that principle to a whole range of things. But I think if you want to drop me a line after this, we can talk about specifics. But that's a very key challenge that often makes a difference between a strong bid and a weak bid. Another question here from Sophie Castledine-Dack. Is there any indication that high street regeneration would not be included in this round of the bid? Again, not that I'm aware of. I think a lot of levelling up is, you know, whether it's physical or social infrastructure, is about high street regeneration. And I think what Mike had said there about how important people see the state of their local high street in terms of local pride, I'd be really surprised if that wasn't there. But Mike, I don't know if you've any. No,
I agree. And the other thing I was going to say that I meant to when we were asked the question about culture is that, you know, these are things which, again, they bear fruit relatively quickly. And in the context of, an election in a couple of years' time, and the government wanting to be able to show that it's made progress on levelling up, being able to kind of have a tangible difference in the feel of a high street or kind of local culture or a local green space, that is the sort of thing that is going to be quite interesting. So it's certainly not the only consideration that's going to be made in terms of which projects are successful. But I think that, those sorts of relatively quick wins are definitely things that will be in ministers' minds.
Excellent. Right, Mike, I'm going to draw us to a close there to give people a couple of minutes to get to their next meeting. First of all, I'd just like to say a huge thank you to you for your time and for sharing those thoughts. Like I said at the start, we will be sharing the slides that we've used, and Mike will also share a link to the full research. If you want to have a further conversation about a Levelling Up Fund bid, or just even local strategic planning, I will also include contact details for Mike and myself. Also worth pointing out that despite the fact that the Levelling Up Fund Round 2 has not launched yet, it's never too early to start thinking about it, because once the starting gun is fired, we don't know how long you'll have. The more work that you can get done identifying priorities and getting your thinking in place before that starts, the better. And just to say as well, I'm also aware that many of you will now be thinking about investment plans for the Shared Prosperity Fund, and certainly it follows along a similar process in terms of trying to decide what to do with that. So I think some of what you've heard today can be applied there as well. So Mike, once again, many thanks, and to everybody who's watching, very much appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, everyone.